Hey there, in this video I'm going to show you how to model a door from the Star Wars show The Mandalorian. Recreating stuff you see in movies or TV shows is one of the best and most fun ways to get good at 3D modeling. I know it's tempting to go straight for the spaceship, but chances are you're gonna end up with nothing but frustration. If you go for a door, you're gonna end up with a door and better skills. I kind of see this like a master study because even simple props like this, they were designed by some of the best people in the industry, and you can learn a lot by their craft by recreating it. Even if you never watched The Mandalorian and you see this door, you'd say it kind of looks like Star Wars because it's all about the functionality, it's rough, it's sturdy, it's not supposed to look good for the characters in the movie. Like they just build it as strong and probably as cheap as possible. And they didn't even bother painting it, and as you can see they didn't even bother cleaning it. So that makes it pretty authentic, but for us as the viewer it still looks cool, and pulling that off is quite difficult and therefore absolutely worth studying. So let's do that. Okay, so I take the screenshot that I think is best for modeling and I just drag it into Blender. By default it's going to be rotated whatever your view is, but we can hit Alt plus R to clear the rotation and Alt plus G to clear the position, so it's exactly at the world center. Then I go into front view with 1 on my numpad and rotate on the x-axis 90 degrees. So I just hit RX90 and I hide the cube by hitting H. And then I choose the image and choose G and Z to move it on the Z axis. And now the next thing we have to do is we have to perfectly align this. So first what I do is I go into the image data here and change the opacity so we can see the grid, and of course that's going to be helpful later on when we do the actual modeling. So just check the opacity, make it down a bit, and now we can position the image. A movie camera is obviously not always perfectly straight for whatever reason, so I go in here and I rotate. I'm still in front view, so it's only rotating on the right axis, and by holding down shift I can really fine tune it. And the next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that the gap of the door, so the middle of the door, is exactly at the middle of our world origin. So once again, thus hit G, and by holding down shift you can really fine tune it. And now I want to set the correct scale. So the first thing that I do is I make sure that the origin of the image is now exactly at the world center. So just go Object, Set Origin, and that means when you scale it, it's always going to be at the same bottom. Then I enable this reference. It's just some random male reference I found on the internet. I made it 175, so kind of the average height of a normal human being. And that way I can get a good idea on what the scale should be like. On a side note, I put this in my Blender startup file, so it's always there, and if I want to check it real quick, I can just turn it on and off and always see what scale I'm working at. So the first thing I want to do is the frame, and I use the box that we already have, and I use this free tool called Automirror. You can just go into Preference, Add On, look for Automirror. It's pretty awesome. What it does is it adds a mirror modifier, but also cuts your object in half at the center axis. So you choose which side you want to keep. I choose to keep the positive, then I click Automirror, and now if I go into edit mode, I hit Shift Z to go into Wireframe, and as you can see we now have two halves. And then I go into the image and uncheck opacity, so it's at full opacity. And what I'm going to try to do is I want to model from like the outside to the inside here. And this intrusion we're going to do later on. So right now I just want to make like the big block out. Okay, so the first thing I do is I go into the mirror modifier and uncheck clipping at merge, so it doesn't merge when they're really close to each other, because I want to be able to drag them outside here and start on the outside. And of course it's very important that you go into wireframe mode with Shift Z or on the top menu bar, because that way when you're selecting the vertices, you're selecting the ones that are also behind. So this is a cube and not just a plane. And then I just move the vertices around, and every time I think, you know what, I need a few more, I'm gonna select the edge, or rather two vertices that I can see, and hit E to extrude them. And you can see sometimes I move them and hold down, like I say, GZ or GX to make sure they are moving exactly on the axis. But I'm not being like that precise with it. I think it doesn't matter for this case if there's a tiny bit. Might even give it a bit of character. What you can always do if you feel like now things got a bit too crooked. So here I can go into edge mode, which means I'm now selecting the top plane, and then I hit SZ0, and that makes the plane perfectly horizontal. And of course I can do the same with the side and say SX0, and now it's perfectly vertical. I continue doing the arc. Also make sure that I'm always using quads. It's not the end of the world if you use like triangles or whatever. Maybe you want to loop cut things, and quads just make things a lot easier in hard surface modeling. And yeah, I try to follow the form as good as I can. When I get close to the middle, I go back into the modifier, and this time I enable clipping at merge, so it becomes one object. Thanks to my quads, whenever I need just more vertices, I can just hit Ctrl plus R to make a loop cut, and then I have more vertices that I can move around, so I can nicely follow the arc. In the end, I zoom out with Shift C, I go back into solid view, and with SY I scale it a bit on the Y-axis. For the intrusion, I want to use a workflow that is pretty close to what the paid add-on box cutter does. Since it's paid, I don't want to use it here. Definitely worth its money, it does way more, saves a lot of time, but we're just going to do it by hand, and since there aren't that many things, it's quite simple to do. So the idea is, instead of making the intrusion in the original model that we just made, we're going to make the intrusion as its own model and then use that with a Boolean modifier on the original. So we're going to say subtract that what we just made from the original, and that way it's non-destructive. You can easily adjust things, you can just move it around, make it deeper, and all of that. It's a really useful workflow. So for that I'm going to make a cube with Shift A, and of course we want to have it on both sides. So I use the Mirror Modifier, and I make somewhat of a mistake here because I cut it in half and then drag it outside, and that means on the side there won't be a face, and then I have to go in later and do that. What you can and probably should do is you add the cube, you go into edit mode, you move it away from the center, and then you add the Mirror Modifier, and that way you have two cubes with like perfect faces on all sides and they are mirrored. The workflow then is pretty much the same. You just position the vertices, make sure you're in front view with one on the numpad, so you're only moving on the X and Z axis. Use the wireframe and always box select the vertices, so you are selecting the ones that are also behind, and move them around. Obviously I try to keep things as quads, so if I do have to loop cut, it's just much easier. And of course, if I want a gap, I can just select some, say Shift D, and then move them around, and now I have two separate meshes. Here you can see there is this tiny gap, and I thought, you know what, I'm just gonna do it the way they did it. You can leave it out, obviously totally up to you, but yeah, so I just loop cut it and make sure that there's this tiny gap in there. For the gap on the top, I only box select one vertex, so meaning the side edge of the cube. And then I extrude that. And of course, when I get close to the middle, I turn on clipping and merge, so now they're getting merged. So you can see I only extruded this face, right, because I only selected those two. And what you can do now, you go 3 into face mode, select those, and now with Alt-E, you can select extrude along normals. And what you can also do is when you hit S, you can change kind of if you want the height to be the same, or if they trying to even it out because they're different angles. So I think I let it at even. And now to bring it back together, on the top there is this auto merge vertices, meaning when you move vertices really close to each other, they are gonna get merged. So I just select those, move them really close, and then by just clicking, so not box selecting, I make sure they're actually now one vertex. By hitting slash, I'm going into isolation mode, also Shift Z to go into solid mode. And this is what I mentioned before, because I cut the box in half and then use like the open half. I'm missing a few faces, and that's gonna be a problem for the Boolean modifier. So what I do here is I just fix it by selecting the edges and then hit F to create faces, and just make sure now they're all perfectly solid and filled. Then I select the object, hit M and choose move to a new collection, and I call this one cutters. So the idea is I can put all the cutters inside there and then I can just hide it but still use them as a boolean. Then I add a boolean modifier to the frame. I choose difference, and for the object I select the cutters that I just hit. So I actually have to enable the collection so I can use this picker, select the object. And now what you can see, it is quite important that the booleans are in the correct order. But every modifier on the top right corner has this little icon that you can use to drag it and change the order. And then I noticed that I was also missing some faces on the top, which is why this little gap isn't showing. So I go ahead and fix that. And so the frame is done, and we have this nice way to modify things. So maybe we think, the intrusion should be a bit deeper or more shallow. All we have to do now is move the cutter object. And of course you can always modify it, move things, maybe make a bit more, and you know. Okay, so here's a little problem when I look at the door, which is I think it doesn't really open. When you see those things on the door, they are extruded, but that means there would have to be a gap where they go inside the frame. There isn't a gap. So I think it would actually just kind of jam. And I was thinking, so how did they open it? I went back and watched and I was like, oh yeah, that's how they open it. They cut through it. So you never see the door opening from that side. That means for us, you could either make this gap, so you make just the frame a bit wider than the door. Or what I chose to do is I just used the other side of the door, which I think looks a bit cooler. And here we have the same shape, but it is intruded, so it just makes a lot more sense that the door can actually open nicely without having this gap inside the frame. To make sure that the door fits perfectly inside the frame, I'm just going to copy the geometry from the frame. So I go in there with face mode, I shift select a few of the faces that I want and I duplicate those. And for that it is of course very important that you turn off the auto merging, otherwise they're just going to get merged right back into it. So you turn it off, Shift D to duplicate, and P separate by selection, and now it is its own object. I select a new object, tab to go into edit mode, front view, wireframe, all the same. And just make sure to extrude the bottom a bit. And I try to make it just a tiny bit smaller, or let's say a tiny bit higher than the frame. I do the same for the middle. And since we copied the geometry from the frame, we also copied the modifiers with it. It's not a problem, we are just going to remove that obviously in a moment, so the doors are going to be different. But for now I just extrude it in the middle, and then I fill everything up with faces. Also what I'm doing here is I try to keep it as quads, so I select some edges on the top and dissolve them with Ctrl X, and loop cut on the bottom, so I have quads. It doesn't really matter that much here. Just make sure that you select the outer edges and hit F, so there's a face for the door. And then we can just apply the mirror modifier. The Boolean modifier, obviously we don't need that, that was just for the intrusion of the frame, so you can hit X, but for the mirror we're gonna say Ctrl A. So now that everything is just one mesh, I make a few loop cuts and just make sure that we split it where the lock is. Now when you hit L, it's going to select all the vertices that are connected. So that's a really good way to just check where the faces belong to. And you can see actually the faces of the lock, they are counted towards the wrong side. So what we do is we select those and hit Y, and that just separated those faces. Then once again I hit L and hover over the right side of the door, and then I hit H to hide it. And now I want to just close the lock, so I select two opposing edges, hit F, that makes a face, and I do that for all the three sides. Now of course the lock is technically still separated, so I hit A to select all vertices and M to merge by distance, and now they're all combined together. And then with Alt plus H we can unhide the other side. With L we select the left side, hide this one, and just clean up the other side. So we just make sure that we close the gaps here. With F, select the edges, and you can also just be sure hit A, M, merge by distance, so you don't have like two vertices in the same spot. And now of course we want them to be separate objects, so choose either side. Once again hit L to select the connected ones and P to separate by selection. And now we have two objects. And of course the door should be a bit thinner than the frame, so select both and then S, Y to scale them on the Y axis. As you may have guessed, for the intrusion of the door we're just going to do the exact same thing. Even though here it's extruded, but as I showed you in the screenshot, on the other side of the door it's exact same design, so we can just use that as reference. So just make a new object, a cube, and maybe be a bit smarter than me, move it outside first before you hit the Automirror, and then everything is pretty much the same. Just make sure that you're in wireframe mode, box select your vertices and move them in the right position. Shift D when you want to duplicate them, so you have separate meshes. When you're done, select the door. You can just select either one of them, add the Boolean modifier, once again difference, and of course choose the cutter that we just made. And then you can also move it in the cutter collection. To copy the modifier, you can select the other door, then shift select the one that has the modifier and Control L, and then you can choose copy modifiers. Saves you like 3 seconds in this case, but just might come in handy when you have a lot of objects and you want to copy modifiers. And then of course you probably want to move the cutter object outside of it. So GY to move it on the Y axis, just see how much it's intruding, and then check it, and yeah, I think that looks okay. And now if you want to add some details, all you have to do is go back into the cutter, of course enable it, maybe slash to go into isolation mode, and then I choose like this thing in the middle. With Control R I make a lot of loop cuts. I'm using the knife tool here on the side to make sure that the loop cut is going to be perfectly vertical. I select all faces, and then on the top you can select and choose checker deselect, so you deselect every second one, and then just extrude them a little bit. The last thing that we need is the lock, so Shift A to add a cube. This time I'm smart enough to not cut it in half right away, so I go into edit mode and then move it. And of course it's important that you do it in edit mode, so you don't move the origin. The origin is still at the world center, and we can just do the Boolean, no, not the Boolean, the mirror modifier later on. And here I try to bring it into position of this grid thing we just did, so it looks like it's got something to do with it. And then I scale it. And of course extrude it and make sure it kind of fits the form. Now with Shift Z I go back into solid mode, just moved it a bit, right? And then I select those faces and extrude them a little bit, and then I scale them on the Z. So SZ, and scale them a little bit inward. I think that is kind of the form that we had here. And then I select the edges on the left and move them in a bit. So I select those and then I say GX and I go back into a front view and the wireframe mode to make sure I'm kind of what the original is here. And you can see in the original the base has like this little gap in there. So I figured it might be a tiny bit easier if we first copy the geometry to make this thing on top. So once again, select those, make sure you turn off Automirror, Shift D and P to separate by selection. And to not get confused, I do some naming here. To make this little gap, I'm just going to loop cut in there, and then with Control B we can bevel the edge that we just created, and then Alt E extrude faces along normals, and this way I just move the mouse in the other direction so it actually moves the faces inward. Now for the thing on the top, I want to get a nice rectangle. If I make 2 loop cuts, it's going to follow the outline. But what I can do is I just make 1 loop cut, which is going to be a perfect horizontal line. With Control B, I bevel it, and then I choose this new rectangle and extrude it a bit. Then I select the edge on the left and top, and with GG or GX, I can move it to the side a bit. With I can inset the face, so I try to get the form of this thing that's intruded. So I have the second face, and then of course all I have to do is hit E and extrude it inward a bit. And then I make sure that I delete all the faces that I don't need here. So just select them, hit X, delete faces. There's a cool detail on the base that I wanted to add, so I go back to this one and I select this face and I want to loop cut it, but I don't want to loop cut through everything and create all these unnecessary vertices. What I can do is I select this, hit Ctrl I to select everything else, and then hit H. And now if I loop cut, I only loop cut through this thing. So I do that, and then I move the loop cut out a bit, and I select those 2 new faces and extrude them. And then I select the top and bottom edges of those and just move them on the Y-axis a bit. I had the Automirror here, but honestly it's not really necessary because I actually went ahead and split those later on again. But what I suggest to do is just like move them into position. Maybe you want to make them a bit thinner, so you move the bottom faces a bit to the front. Just whatever you think looks right. Now, depending on what you want to do with the door, you might want to make sure there is an actual hole in the frame so the door can go through there. For that, I select the door, then I select the outer faces, Shift D to duplicate, P, separate by selection, and I'm going to use this as my third and last cutter object. And then I extrude the faces on the X-axis. And since this object is going to be hidden, doesn't matter what it looks like, you can just do it like this, and then you scale it on the X-axis like crazy. And then I scale it a tiny bit on the Y-axis, so I make it a little bit wider so that, you know, the hole in the frame is a bit wider than the door. Obviously that's kind of optional. And then of course, to make sure to cut it, I go back to the frame, add another bool modifier and choose our new cutter object as the object. Now I went ahead and applied all the modifiers. And before I do that, I actually copy the entire collection just to make sure that it's a bit easier to go back, because it wouldn't be the first time that I apply the modifiers and then 5 minutes later I realized, nah, I need to change something. If you behave and you do incremental saves, which I obviously recommend, then you might go back. But you know, just copy the collection. You can go back, pick some things there. And obviously you don't have to do that. I chose to do it because I want this to be a game asset. And there is a chance I want to bake the lighting, and that means I don't want like the left and the right side or whatever to occupy the same space on the UV map. Hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, then you probably don't need it yet. The main idea is simply that the lighting on the right and left side of the frame might be different in your game, and if they occupy the same space on the image that saves like the lighting information, what's going to happen is Unity just keeps overriding. But again, if you don't do that, you can keep the modifiers. I, however, want to make sure they're just all applied. Okay, so let's go into the UV editing tab. And when you select an object, go into edit mode, you can see things don't look so good. They're overlapping. There's one face that's stretched super weirdly. But luckily, all you have to do is go into face mode with 3, hit A for all, and then U, and choose Smart UV Project. You probably want some island margin here so they're not touching each other, and then maybe get a bit of bleed, so some pixels that shouldn't be there just go on the other side. And nice thing is, so often with hard surface modeling, I can check there's no stretch, so pretty nice, it's gonna work quite well. And then just do it with all the other objects. This is also a good moment to check that you don't have faces that are pointing in the wrong direction, and they will be invisible in Unity. So here in the layout you can choose face orientation, and if something is red, it means they're pointing in the wrong direction. But just select them, and then with Shift N it's gonna say recalculate normals, and in almost all cases Blender is gonna hit it in the right direction, and now they're all pointing outward. Now that everything is unwrapped, we are gonna need some material, and I'm going to use a pretty typical low poly technique, which is you're gonna take an image that has a bunch of colors, and it's usually a really small image, and then you simply scale the faces really small on that image so they're all on this one color. So by default, the first object that we made already has a material, which is called material. So in the shading tab, you can just rename it. And then for the color, you want to say like, take the colors from this image texture. So Shift A, image texture, and then you just got to open it and choose it, one that you have on your hard drive. For an actual game, you would probably use an image that is just really 1 pixel per 1 color that you want. So you can have like an 8x8 pixel color or something. What I did is I Googled for like Star Wars color palette, and I found this pretty cool article where someone made an AI that analyzed all the Star Wars movies and turned it into a color palette. And I thought, oh, why not just work with this, practice a bit. And so I used this color palette here. So the workflow here is pretty simple. In the UV editing tab, you just make sure that you open this image that you just did in the image texture. If you did it, then it should already show up, so you don't have to go inside the folder again. Then on the right side, you're gonna pick the object, go into edit mode and face mode. And every face that you select here is gonna show up on the left side. And you can use all the same commands on the left side. So scale to scale it down, S to scale it, sorry, and G to move it. And on the right side, when you go into look depth or shading mode, you can see now the colors are getting applied. And if you want some faces to be a different color, you just select them on the right side and move them to the right color on the left side. And that's really the entire workflow. The other object is not going to have the material by default, but of course just select the object, and then in the material tab, that's on the right side, the bottom thing, choose this Star Wars palette. And also you should probably make sure that when you scale them down, they're still not overlapping. I got a bit careless here. I think I'm going to see how that looks in Unity later on today. The cool thing is you can also quite easily change colors around. So at first I tried to go for this like dark and blue thing, and then I thought just do another iteration, just make it maybe dark, white and orange. Okay, so this is it for this tutorial. I hope you learned something. You would do me a huge favor by subscribing to this channel and liking this video. And I think in the next video we are gonna take this thing to Unity, add some animations and maybe a few scripts so you can open it by button or automatic. And yeah, this is it. Hope you enjoyed it and goodbye.